The world dissolved into a blade of sharpened metal and a wild, vacant stare. One moment, Nurse Sarah Jenkins was taping a fresh dressing onto a young Marine's fractured wrist. The next, a shadow erupted from the adjacent bay. There was no war cry, no warning, only a guttural roar and the glint of something crude and silver. The man, a drifter with eyes like burnt-out fuses, was a blur of motion, lunging not at her, but at the uniformed soldier beside her. Corporal Marcus Thorne was vulnerable, his good arm trapped in a sling, his body angled away. Sarah saw it all in a horrifying slow-motion tableau. The weapon arcing down, the boy's wide, unsuspecting eyes, the certainty of impact. In that sliver of a second, the universe of rules, protocols, and personal safety evaporated. All that remained was a single, primal instinct, a shepherd defending the flock. She didn't think. She moved. A shove of a rolling medical cart, a desperate lunge, and her own body became a shield. The first impact was a shocking, cold punch to her shoulder. It stole her breath. The second, a searing tear in her side. Pain, white-hot and absolute, blossomed through her torso. She heard a choked cry. Was it hers or the Marine's? As she wrapped her arms around his head, pulling him down and away, absorbing the frantic, brutal percussion on her back. 1, 2, 3 more impacts. She felt the fabric of her scrubs turn hot and wet. Her world narrowed to the desperate need to keep this boy safe, a promise she made to every patient who came through the ER doors, and perhaps an older, deeper promise made to the memory of her own father's uniform. Security alarms blared like a distant scream. Shouts echoed around her. The frantic assault stopped as suddenly as it began, the weight of the attacker wrenched away by unseen hands. Sarah's strength vanished. Her knees buckled, and the linoleum floor rushed up to meet her. Her last conscious sight was the horrified, grateful face of Corporal Thorne, his mouth forming her name as the controlled chaos of St. Michael's Hospital spiraled into a vortex of darkness. Just 10 minutes earlier, that chaos had been ordinary. It was the familiar rhythm of a Friday night in a city ER, a symphony of human misery and resilience that Sarah Jenkins conducted with weary expertise. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic cleaner, latex, and fear. Monitors beeped their relentless electronic pulse, a backdrop to the cacophony of a baby's wail, a drunk's slurred profanity, and the frantic squeak of rubber-soled shoes on polished floors. Sarah moved through it all like a ship steady in a storm. At 34, her features were framed by a tired competence. The compassion in her eyes was genuine, but guarded, shielded by the sheer volume of trauma she witnessed daily. She was the one who could calm a child terrified of needles with a soft word and a sticker, then turn and handle a belligerent addict with a tone of unshakable authority. She and her friend, Dr. Ben Carter, shared a look over the top of a cubicle wall, a silent exchange of gallows humor that said, "Can you believe this night?" Another motorcycle versus lamppost, Bennett sighed, gesturing with his head toward the newest arrival. Kid's lucky. Just a nasty wrist fracture. That kid was Corporal Marcus Thorne. He sat on the edge of the gurney, his face pale but his posture ramrod straight, as if trying to project military discipline even in his vulnerable state. He was young, impossibly young, Sarah thought, with a dusting of freckles across his nose that clashed with the stoicism in his eyes. His motorcycle jacket was scuffed, but his manners were immaculate. He called her ma'am, his voice steady despite the obvious pain. "My gunny is going to have my hide for this," he said with a grimace as Sarah expertly examined the break. "Well, let's focus on getting you patched up first, Corporal," she replied, her voice calm and reassuring. "We can worry about the gunny later. My dad was Army, Vietnam. He used to say the scariest thing on a base was a first sergeant with a clipboard." A small, genuine smile touched Marcus's lips. "That's the truth, ma'am." It was a tiny moment of connection, a bridge built between two worlds. For Sarah, it was a flicker of something she deeply respected, the quiet dignity of service. Her own father had brought the war home in his silences, in the way he stared at nothing, but he had also brought home a fierce code of honor, of looking out for the person next to you. It was a code she tried to live by in the controlled warfare of the ER. She was setting his wrist in a temporary cast, the fiberglass wrap cool against his skin, when the police brought in the drifter. He was just another piece of the night's chaotic mosaic. Agitated, muttering, a superficial cut on his arm that barely warranted a stitch. Standard procedure dictated he be placed in the nearest open bay to await evaluation. The nearest bay was right next to Corporal Thorne. Sarah finished her work, giving Marcus's cast a final, gentle pat. "All right, you're all set for now. The ortho will see you in the morning. Try not to get into any more fights with inanimate objects." He nodded, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, ma'am. Seriously." Those were the last normal words spoken before the world shattered, before a piece of sharpened metal changed everything, before Sarah Jenkins made a choice that would cost her everything, and then deliver her an honor she could never have imagined. Time fractured. The ER's symphony of beeps and voices twisted into a single, discordant shriek. The drifter, who had been muttering on his gurney, moved with a speed that defied his haggard appearance. He didn't just rise, he exploded. The thin IV tube ripped from his arm, spattering a line of blood on the pristine floor. In his hand, what looked like a piece of scrap metal, sharpened to a vicious point, appeared as if from nowhere. His target was pure chance. It was the uniform, the symbol of order in his disordered mind. Marcus Thorne, still processing Sarah's parting words, saw the movement from the corner of his eye. He tried to pivot, to defend himself, but the sling holding his broken arm made him clumsy, off balance. He was a trained warrior, trapped in a moment of civilian vulnerability. Sarah saw the entire sequence unfold in less than a heartbeat. It was the kind of split-second calculation that emergency personnel make without conscious thought. There was no time to yell for security, who were already occupied with another incident down the hall. No time to reason. No time for the hospital's carefully outlined non-engagement protocols. There was only time for action. Her body moved on its own accord, fueled by a surge of pure adrenaline. She shoved the heavy metal instrument cart with a clang, sending it careening into the path of another nurse, a desperate, silent warning. Then she launched herself forward, her mind a blank slate except for a single, screaming imperative: "Protect him!" She collided with Marcus just as the first blow landed. It was a brutal, shocking impact to her right shoulder, a spike of cold fire that radiated through her entire body. The force of it drove her into Marcus, and they stumbled backward together. She wrapped her arms around his head and neck, instinctively shielding his most vital areas, turning her own back to the storm. Then came the rest. A rapid, frantic series of stabs that felt less like cuts and more like being beaten with a hot poker. One in her side, just under her ribs, that made her gasp for air. Another and another and another across her back. She lost count. It was just a percussion of agony, a brutal rhythm of violence. Through the roaring in her ears, she heard Marcus yelling, a sound of shock and fury. She heard screams from other patients, the clatter of dropped instruments, the pounding of running feet. She clung to the soldier, her world reduced to the texture of his jacket under her cheek, and the waves of pain washing over her. She could feel the warmth spreading across her back and side, a terrifying, sticky wetness. Her legs felt like water. The ER lights began to pulse, dimming at the edges of her vision. The assault ended as abruptly as it had started. The weight and pressure on her back vanished, replaced by the shouts of security guards. "Down on the ground! Down now!" Sarah's job was done. Her body knew it before her mind did. Her grip on Marcus slackened. Her knees gave way. The polished linoleum floor seemed to tilt, rising up to claim her. As she fell, her gaze locked with Marcus's. The shock on his face was warring with a dawning horror and a profound, unmistakable gratitude. He was safe. That was her last coherent thought. The darkness swirled in, pulling her under. The frantic, terrified voice of Ben Carter, shouting her name, was the last sound she heard as the world faded to black. 7 seconds. That's all it took to transform a life of quiet service into a crucible of pain and betrayal. Sarah's return to consciousness was not a gentle drift, but a violent yank back into a world of pain. Every breath was a battle against a hot, sharp agony in her side. A dull, throbbing ache radiated from her shoulder and back, a map of the violence she had endured. The rhythmic, sterile beep of a monitor was no longer part of the ER's ambient noise. It was her own, a metronome counting out her fragile hold on the present. She was in a private room in the ICU, her own hospital. She tried to push herself up, a groan escaping her lips, but a fire in her ribs forced her back down against the starchy sheets. Her body felt alien, a broken vessel. It was in this state of helplessness that she met her first visitor. It wasn't a friend or a colleague offering comfort. It was a man in a rumpled suit, his face a mask of weary indifference. "Ms. Jenkins? I'm Detective Miller." He stood by her bed, notepad in hand, his presence filling the small room with a chillingly official air. He didn't ask how she was feeling. He began his questions as if he were investigating a traffic accident. "I need you to walk me through the events of last night," he said, his voice flat. "Specifically, your decision to physically intervene with the suspect." Sarah blinked, her mind foggy from painkillers. "The suspect? You mean the man who—" The words caught in her throat. "He was going to kill the soldier, Marcus." Detective Miller jotted something down. "So you consciously chose to leave your assigned station and violate hospital protocol regarding patient engagement and physical contact?" The question landed like a slap. Protocol? She had just been stabbed nearly to death protecting someone, and he was asking about protocol? A flicker of bewildered anger cut through the haze of medication. "There was no time for protocol," she whispered, each word an effort. "He would be dead." "Did you attempt to use the panic button before engaging?" Miller continued, his eyes never leaving his notepad. "Did you shout a verbal warning to security personnel? Did you attempt to de-escalate the situation from a safe distance as your training dictates?" His questions were a clinical dissection of a moment that had been pure, raw instinct. He was creating a timeline, a report, and in his version of the story, she wasn't a hero who had saved a life, but an unpredictable civilian who had complicated a crime scene. She had contaminated the narrative with her own blood. I don't remember," she managed, the fight draining out of her. She was too weak, too broken to defend the most selfless act of her life. Miller sighed, a small, impatient sound. He finished his notes, clicked his pen, and placed a business card on her bedside table. "The suspect is in custody. Name's John Doe for now, not talking. We'll be in touch if we need anything else." He left without another word. Sarah stared at the card, her vision blurring with unshed tears. It wasn't the physical pain that made her cry. It was the sudden, terrifying realization that in the cold, unblinking eyes of the system she had served her entire adult life, she had already been judged, and she had been found at fault. Later that afternoon, Ben Carter slipped into the room, his face a mixture of relief and fury. He gently took her hand, his touch a welcome warmth in the sterile coldness of the room. "Sarah, my God, we were so scared," he said softly. He proceeded to explain the damage. 7 stab wounds. The one to her shoulder was deep but missed the artery. The ones on her back were messy. The worst were the 2 to her side. One had punctured her left lung, collapsing in. Another had nicked the top of her kidney. "You're lucky," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Incredibly, stupidly lucky to be alive." "Lucky?" she repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. Ben's expression darkened. "Listen, Sarah, I have to warn you. The administration is in full-blown CYA mode. They've been having closed-door meetings since last night." He lowered his voice. "They're worried about the optics, about the liability." The detective's questions suddenly made a chilling kind of sense. They weren't his questions. They were the hospital's. She had survived the attack. Now she had the distinct feeling she might not survive the aftermath. 2 days later, the embodiment of the hospital's aftermath walked into her room. Richard Davis was a man who seemed to have been assembled from a catalog of corporate ambition. His suit was an expensive shade of charcoal gray. His shoes gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and his smile was a masterpiece of insincere perfection. He carried not a bouquet of flowers, but a slim, leather-bound tablet. "Sarah, a terrible business. Just terrible," he began, his voice smooth as polished marble. He pulled up a chair but sat on its edge, as if too important to fully commit to the act of sitting. The entire St. Michael's family is pulling for your speedy recovery. Sarah watched him, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. She knew this type. She'd seen them glide through the hospital corridors, their eyes fixed on budgets and donor reports, blind to the human drama unfolding in the rooms they passed. "Thank you, Mr. Davis," she said, her voice raspy. "Please, call me Richard," he said with that same empty smile. He tapped his tablet. "Now, I know this is a difficult time, but we do need to go over the official incident report. A bit of housekeeping." The housekeeping began with a clinical, detached summary of the event, stripped of all heroism and humanity. Then came the pivot. "Your actions, Sarah," he said, his tone shifting to one of a disappointed parent, "while certainly well-intentioned, constituted a significant breach of established hospital protocol. Specifically, Regulation 7.4, subsection B, which outlines the staff's responsibility to maintain a safe distance and await the intervention of our trained security personnel in any violent confrontation." Sarah stared at him, dumbfounded. He was about to stab a defenseless man, Mr. Davis. There was no security personnel. They were on another floor. Davis held up a placating hand. "I understand it was a chaotic situation, but protocols exist for a reason. They exist to protect everyone, the patients, the staff, and, frankly, the hospital's liability exposure. Our security team is trained and, more importantly, insured for those scenarios." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Your intervention, noble as it may have felt in the moment, creates a very complex legal and financial situation for us. It sets a dangerous precedent." The cold knot in Sarah's stomach turned to ice. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Davis said, his voice losing its fabricated warmth and taking on a sharp corporate edge, "that our insurer is flagging the case. Because you acted outside the clearly defined scope of your duties and in direct violation of safety protocols, your workers' compensation claim is currently under review." The words hit her harder than any of the stab wounds. Under review. It was a bureaucratic euphemism for denied. "Furthermore," he continued, relentless, "pending the outcome of a full internal investigation into the incident and your conduct, we believe it's in everyone's best interest to place you on unpaid administrative leave." Unpaid leave. She had been stabbed 7 times, saving a life in his hospital, and she was being fired. No, it was worse than being fired. She was being punished, cast out, and saddled with the financial burden of her own heroism. "Look at it from our perspective, Sarah," Davis said, attempting a tone of reasonableness that was more insulting than any shout. "If every nurse decided to play the hero whenever they felt like it, we'd have anarchy. The system only works if everyone follows the rules. I'm sure you can understand that." He stood up, placing a thin, corporate-branded folder on her bedside table. "This contains copies of the protocols in question for your review. Our PR team will be issuing a statement later today emphasizing the importance of following our safety procedures to ensure a secure environment for all. We wish you the best in your recovery." He left. The room was silent again, but now the silence was filled with a roaring injustice. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the folder. Inside were pages of sterile, legalistic text, highlighting the very rules she had broken to save a man's life. The physical pain was a fire in her body, but this betrayal, was a shard of ice in her soul. She had been stabbed twice, once with a knife and once with a policy. A week later, Sarah was home. The word home felt wrong. Her small 2-bedroom suburban house had always been her sanctuary from the chaos of the ER, a place of quiet order. Now it was a prison, each familiar object a reminder of a life that had been snatched away. Her body was a landscape of pain. Simple tasks became monumental efforts. Making a cup of tea was a 10-minute ordeal of careful movements, each one punctuated by a sharp, pulling sensation in her side. Changing the dressings on her wounds was a nauseating ritual that left her trembling and exhausted. The silence was the worst part. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, a stark contrast to the constant noise of the hospital she had lived in for so long. She found herself turning on the television just to have voices in the house, But the voices only brought more pain. She was flicking through channels when a local news anchor's face appeared. And an update on the incident at St. Michael's Hospital last week. Her heart pounded. She listened as the reporter recited a version of the story that was technically true but morally bankrupt. It was a clinical report quoting the hospital's official PR statement, almost verbatim. An unfortunate incident where hospital safety protocols were not followed. The report cut to a pre-recorded interview with a workplace safety consultant who spoke in grave tones about the dangers of employees playing hero and becoming a liability. My God, Sarah thought. They're using my pain as a training seminar. There was no mention of Marcus Thorne's life being saved. There was only the implication that she, Sarah Jenkins, was reckless. The mail, when it came, felt like a deliberate act of cruelty. It wasn't get-well cards. It was a cascade of medical bills. The ambulance transport, the ICU stay, the surgeon's fees, all with terrifyingly high patient responsibility balances. Her insurance would cover a portion, but with her workers' compensation claim in bureaucratic limbo, the rest fell to her. Staring at the bold, red, past due stamp on one of the envelopes, she felt a wave of dizziness. Ben Carter was her only regular visitor. He arrived with bags of groceries and a face etched with helpless fury. "It's even worse than you think," he told her, unpacking soup cans onto her counter. Davis held a mandatory staff meeting. We were all reminded of the non-engagement policy. He made it clear that speaking to the press was a grounds for immediate dismissal. The official story inside the hospital is that you're a cautionary tale. "And Marcus?" Sarah asked, her voice small. "The soldier?" "Discharged back to the base a few days ago," Ben said, his anger softening into sadness. "He was asking for you, apparently, but they had you in isolation in the ICU. I'm sure they told him you were fine and sent him on his way. Administration wants this whole thing to disappear." That night, Sarah sat in her darkened living room, the pile of bills on the coffee table looking like a monument to her folly. The physical wounds would heal, the scars would fade. But this feeling, this profound, crushing isolation, felt permanent. She had poured her life into a system that, when tested, had thanked her by casting her out and branding her a fool. She had done the right thing, and her reward was to be left alone in the dark, with her pain, her debt, and her professional ruin. The audience of her life, it seemed, had left the theater. Miles away, in the Spartan quiet of a barracks room at the Camp Lejeune Marine Corps base, Corporal Marcus Thorne was fighting a different kind of battle. His arm, now encased in a hard green cast, was a constant, dull ache. But it was the memory that tormented him. He couldn't close his eyes without seeing it. The wild look on the attacker's face, the glint of the blade, and the impossible, instantaneous appearance of Nurse Jenkins. He remembered the impacts. He hadn't felt them, but he had heard them, a series of sickening wet thuds against her body. He remembered the warmth of her blood seeping through his jacket as she collapsed. The hospital staff had been cagey, offering placating non-answers when he'd asked about her condition. "She's in the best hands," they'd said, before discharging him with a handful of prescriptions and a follow-up appointment. Frustrated and worried, he had turned to the internet. He found the local news story. He read the clinical report, the hospital's self-serving statement about protocols, and the expert's analysis of her recklessness. A cold, hard rage, the kind he'd only ever felt in combat, began to burn in his chest. This was wrong. This was a lie. They were twisting her sacrifice into a mistake. They were erasing her. In the Marine Corps, some debts are absolute. A man buys you a drink, you buy him one back. A man watches your back on patrol, you owe him your life. A woman takes 7 stab wounds meant for you. That was a debt of honor so profound it transcended any civilian rulebook. The idea that she was being punished for it wasn't just unjust. It was an insult to the very core of his ethos. You don't leave your wounded on the battlefield. Ever. He stared at the chain of command chart pinned to the corkboard above his bunk. His gaze moved past the squad leader, past the platoon sergeant, and settled on one name. He knew that complaining up the chain was usually a fool's errand, but this wasn't a complaint. This was a call to arms. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact. He took a deep breath, the sterile scent of the barracks filling his lungs, and pressed the call button. The voice that answered was crisp, no nonsense. "Rostova." Gunny, Marcus said, his own voice tight with a mixture of respect and urgency. It's Corporal Thorne. I'm sorry to bother you off hours. What is it, Thorne? I need to talk to you about something that happened when I was on leave, he said. It's about the woman who saved my life. The silence on the other end of the line was not impatient. It was attentive. A switch had been flipped. The first spark had been struck in the darkness, and a network governed by a code of loyalty, not liability, began to stir. Gunnery Sergeant Eva Rostova's office was a testament to her personality, sparse, immaculate, and radiating an aura of disciplined intimidation. A neatly framed commendation hung on one wall, a large tactical map of a forgotten desert on the other. She sat behind her steel desk, her posture perfect, and listened. She did not interrupt. Marcus Thorne stood before her, his one good hand clenched into a fist at his side, and he told her everything. He started with the motorcycle mishap, the kindness of the nurse, and then recounted the attack in raw, visceral detail. He didn't spare himself describing his own vulnerability, his own shock. Then, his voice hardening, he told her what came after. The hospital's evasiveness, the misleading news story he'd found online, the official statement about protocol violation. He told her the nurse's name, Sarah Jenkins. When he finished, Rostova remained silent for a full minute. The only sound in the room was the hum of the air conditioner. She stared at a point just past Marcus's shoulder, her sharp, intelligent eyes processing the information, not as a story, but as a battlefield assessment. She was identifying the enemy, the objective, and the available assets. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm, but with an undercurrent of cold fury. Corporal, in the field, when a Marine is hit, we do two things. We eliminate the threat, and we get our wounded off the line. We do not stop to consult a rulebook. We do not leave them behind. And we sure as hell don't patch them up and then send them a bill for the bullets we took for them. She leaned forward, her gaze locking onto his. This is unacceptable. The validation in her voice was so powerful it almost buckled Marcus's knees. She understood. She saw it not through the lens of a lawyer or a PR firm, but through the unwavering lens of the Marine Corps Code. The hospital administration, she said, her tone making it sound like a hostile entity. What was the name of the man in charge? Davis, Marcus said. Richard Davis. Rostova nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. And the news channel? He told her. She absorbed the details, filing them away. Her mind, trained for logistics and strategy, was already formulating a plan. It would not involve lawyers or petitions. It would be a response in a language the hospital administration, in its corporate arrogance, had forgotten existed. The language of honor. You did the right thing bringing this to me, Thorne, she said, her tone shifting back to that of a commanding officer. It was a dismissal. You're on light duty until that arm is healed. Go to PT. I will handle this administrative review. The contempt with which she said the last two words was more potent than any curse. Marcus nodded, offered a crisp, yes, Gunny, and departed, a weight lifting from his shoulders for the first time in days. As soon as the door clicked shut, Gunnery Sergeant Rostova picked up her phone. She didn't call a lawyer. She called the battalion sergeant major. Then she sent a text message to a handful of other senior NCOs in the unit, men and women she had served with for years. The message was simple. Need to talk. My office, 1800. It's about Thorne. That evening, as the sun set over the sprawling base, word began to spread, not as a formal order, but as something more powerful, a story. It moved through the mess halls, the gyms, and the barracks. A civvy nurse took 7 shanks for the new guy in Thorne's platoon. Hospitals screwing her over, calling her a liability. The story offended them. It struck a nerve deep in their collective identity. They were a tribe, a brotherhood forged in shared hardship, and their code was simple. You protect your own. And Sarah Jenkins, by her actions, had just become one of their own. A quiet, powerful force was beginning to mobilize, its purpose singular and its methods unspoken. The system that had betrayed Sarah was about to reckon with a system it couldn't possibly comprehend. Dawn broke over Sarah's quiet suburban street, painting the sky in pale shades of pink and gray. For Sarah, it was just the start of another day in her personal purgatory. The sharp, tearing pain of her wounds had subsided into a constant, dull ache, a permanent reminder of her new reality. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the crushing weight on her soul. She sat at her small kitchen table staring at an official-looking envelope that had arrived the day before. An eviction notice. With her pay cut off and her savings dwindling to cover the initial onslaught of medical bills, she had missed her rent payment. The stark, legalistic language of the notice was another sterile blade twisting in the wound of the hospital's betrayal. She felt a profound sense of defeat. The fight had gone out of her. She pushed herself up from the table, her body protesting with a groan, and limped to her front window. She looked out at the tranquil street, at the manicured lawns and sleeping houses. It was a world of normalcy that felt a million miles away. A world she no longer belonged to. That's when she heard it. It was a sound so out of place in the morning quiet that at first, she couldn't identify it. A soft, rhythmic, percussive sound. Thump. Thump, like a single, slow drum beat. It was the sound of a pair of perfectly polished boots hitting the pavement. Then another sound joined it, falling into perfect sync. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. Then 4 more. Then 10. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was a sound of immense, controlled power. A growing tide of unified rhythm that seemed to make the very air vibrate. A knot of confusion and a flicker of fear tightened in her chest. She moved to the front door, her heart beginning to pound against her ribs. A frantic, panicked beat against the steady, disciplined rhythm from outside. She pressed her eye to the peephole, the small fisheye lens offering a distorted view of her front lawn. She saw a man. He was standing on the sidewalk directly across from her house, his back ramrod straight, his hands clasped behind him. He was wearing the United States Marine Corps dress blue uniform, the dark blue jacket and pristine white cap, a startling vision of formality in the early morning light. Then another Marine marched into the frame, taking up a position beside the first. And another, and another. They moved with a silent, eerie precision, filling the distorted view of the peephole until all she could see was a wall of disciplined blue and stoic faces. Her breath caught in her throat. What was happening? This had to be a mistake. They had the wrong house. It was some kind of official visit, a notification of some terrible news meant for a different family on a different street. With a trembling hand, she reached for the deadbolt. Sarah unlocked and pulled open her front door. The rhythmic sound of marching boots stopped instantly. The silence that fell in its wake was more profound, more absolute than any sound she had ever heard. It was a silence that commanded attention. She stepped onto her porch and her mind struggled to process what her eyes were seeing. Her street, her quiet, ordinary suburban street, was gone. In its place stood an army of honor. From her porch to the end of the block, the street and sidewalks were filled with United States Marines. There were at least 100 of them, perhaps more. They were not in combat fatigues, but in their immaculate dress blue uniforms. The high-collared jackets adorned with ribbons and medals, the white trousers with their razor-sharp creases, the gleaming white caps. They stood in perfect, silent formations, a phalanx of blue and gold that seemed to hold back the ordinary world. They left a single, clear path from the sidewalk to her front steps, and they were all facing her. Their expressions were unreadable, stoic. Their collective gaze a silent, powerful testament. Windows up and down the street were filled with the faces of her curious, dumbfounded neighbors. A car attempting to turn onto the block had stopped dead, its driver staring, mouth agape. From the center of the formation, 2 figures detached and began to walk up her driveway. They moved with the same crisp precision as the others. One was a woman, a gunnery sergeant, her face sharp and intelligent, her presence radiating an unshakable authority. The other was Corporal Marcus Thorne. His arm was still in a sling, but he too was in his dress blues, his young face a mixture of solemn respect and profound gratitude. They stopped 5 feet from where Sarah stood, frozen on her top step. The gunnery sergeant did not salute. This was not a formal military ceremony. This was something far more personal, far more potent. "Miss Jenkins," the woman said, her voice clear and strong, easily carrying in the morning stillness. "I'm Gunnery Sergeant Eva Rostova. This is Corporal Thorne. He told us what you did." Sarah could only shake her head, 1,000 confused thoughts swirling in her mind. I... I don't understand," she whispered, the words barely audible. "You were injured protecting one of my Marines," Rostova stated, her words simple, direct, and heavy with meaning. "In our world, that makes you one of ours, and the Marine Corps does not leave its people behind." Rostova's eyes, clear and unwavering, met Sarah's. "We heard you were on unpaid administrative leave," she said, the term dripping with disdain. "So we're here to take the watch. We'll stand guard over your home until the people who owe you a debt of honor remember what that word means." As Rostova finished speaking, Marcus Thorne stepped forward. He held a thick, plain white envelope in his good hand. His eyes were shining with unshed tears. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "this is from the unit, from all of us. It's your back pay, and then some. So you don't have to worry about the rent." Sarah looked from Rostova's fiercely loyal face to Marcus's earnest, grateful one. She looked past them, at the sea of silent, steadfast Marines who had come to stand guard over her broken life. An entire army assembled on her lawn, not for war, but for a single quiet act of profound decency. And the dam broke. The wall of isolation, of pain, of betrayal, and of despair that she had built around her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Tears, hot and silent, streamed down her face. They were not tears of sadness or self-pity. They were tears of overwhelming, cathartic relief. She was not alone. She had never been alone. At the end of the street, a local news van, likely sent to do a follow-up on the protocol-violating nurse, screeched to a halt. A cameraman scrambled out, his jaw dropping as he was confronted not with a sad, isolated victim, but with a scene of such powerful, silent honor that it would dominate the national news for days. The narrative, so carefully controlled by the hospital, had just been irrevocably seized by 100 silent guardians. Richard Davis's elegantly appointed office, normally a sanctuary of controlled calm, was now a pressure cooker. He was pacing, his silk tie loosened, as he yelled into his phone at the head of his public relations department. "What do you mean you can't spin this? It's 100 men in costumes standing on a lawn. Make them look like fanatics, intimidators." On the large monitor mounted to his wall, a live helicopter feed showed the scene. It did not look fanatical. It looked biblical. The image of the silent, stoic Marines standing guard like statues was breathtakingly powerful. The chyron on the screen read, "A debt of honor." Below it, a hashtag was already exploding across social media. #MarinesForSarah. His other line was blinking incessantly. It was the chairman of the board, the mayor's office, a congresswoman, and most terrifyingly, the director of the Henderson Foundation, the philanthropic giant that had just pledged $50 million to the hospital's new pediatric oncology wing. The story was no longer local. It was the #1 trending topic in the country. The narrative he had so carefully crafted of a well-intentioned but reckless employee had been utterly and completely obliterated by a single, silent, visual statement of loyalty. The court of public opinion had reached its verdict, and it was brutal. An email popped up on his screen. It was a public statement from the Henderson Foundation. It was short and lethal. It read, "The Henderson Foundation believes that honor, courage, and selfless sacrifice are the cornerstones of community. We are deeply disturbed by the reports concerning the treatment of nurse Sarah Jenkins by St. Michael's Hospital. We are placing our recent pledge under immediate review and will reconsider our support unless this situation is rectified with the same level of honor Ms. Jenkins displayed." Davis felt the blood drain from his face. That wasn't a warning shot, it was a kill shot. Miles away, in the beige cubicle farm of the city's police precinct, Detective Miller was watching the same news feed on his computer. He looked down at the file on his desk, its cover bearing Sarah Jenkins' name. He read his own notes, the cold, procedural questions about protocols and engagement distances. He had seen a messy crime scene, a civilian who had complicated his investigation. He looked back at the screen, at the close-up of Sarah's tear-streaked face, a look of profound, soul-deep relief washing over her. He looked at the faces of the Marines, young and old, standing their silent watch. They hadn't seen a complication. They had seen a hero who needed defending. A wave of shame, unfamiliar and unpleasant, washed over him. He had followed the letter of the law and had missed its entire spirit. He picked up his desk phone and dialed the district attorney's office. His tone, when he began to speak, was no longer detached. "Yeah, hi, it's Miller," he said. "Listen, regarding the St. Michael's assault case, I think we need to seriously reevaluate the hospital administration's role in what happened after the attack. There might be a case for reckless endangerment here." Back in his office, Richard Davis slammed his phone down, the plastic cracking under the force. He was cornered. The institutional power he had wielded with such casual arrogance, the power of policies and press releases and liability clauses, was as fragile as glass against the unbreakable moral force of a promise kept. The fallout was swift and merciless. The next 24 hours unfolded in a montage of humiliation for the hospital and vindication for Sarah. The first scene was Richard Davis, his face pale and sweating under the harsh lights of television cameras, standing at a podium hastily erected in the hospital lobby. He looked haggard, his expensive suit now looking more like a costume. He read from a prepared statement, his voice cracking. He announced that Nurse Sarah Jenkins was being awarded the hospital's highest honor, the St. Michael's Cross for Valor, along with a full, unconditional reinstatement, complete back pay, and a public, heartfelt apology. He added that the hospital would, of course, be covering every cent of her medical expenses and providing a significant bonus for her extraordinary bravery. It was a complete and total capitulation. A news graphic that evening would announce his resignation, effective immediately. The next scene showed the hospital's board of directors announcing the immediate formation of a new staff protection and valor policy, with an independent oversight committee to review any incident involving violence against its employees. They pledged a multi-million-dollar upgrade to the hospital's security systems. The third scene was quieter. Detective Miller's cruiser was parked in front of Sarah's house. The Marines, who had organized themselves into respectful, rotating shifts, parted to let him through. He walked up to Sarah's porch, where she was sitting on a rocking chair, a blanket over her lap. He took off his hat. "Ms. Jenkins," he began, his voice devoid of its former bureaucratic chill, "I came here to apologize, my job. It makes you see things a certain way. Procedural, detached. I was wrong. What you did was heroic. Period. I just wanted you to hear me say that." He informed her that his office was officially recommending the DA investigate the hospital for criminally negligent policies that led to her being endangered. It was more than an apology. It was an act of penance. Meanwhile, the GoFundMe that one of the younger Marines had set up, with an initial goal of a few $1,000s to cover Sarah's rent, had gone supernova. Donations from every state in the nation poured in. The total rocketed past 100,000, then 500,000, then $1 million. The comments section was a tidal wave of support for Sarah and outrage at the hospital. A few days later, the last of the Marines departed. Their mission was complete. The watch was over. Before they left, Gunnery Sergeant Rostova and Corporal Thorne came to the door one last time. There were no grand speeches, no ceremony. Rostova simply shook Sarah's hand, her grip firm, and her eyes conveying a deep, unspoken respect. "You ever need anything," she said, "you have our number." Marcus, his arm now in a much smaller brace, simply said, "Thank you, Sarah, for everything." It was simple. It was profound. It was a bond forged not in policy, but in sacrifice. As Sarah watched their car drive away down her now quiet street, she knew her life would never be the same. The scars on her body were a map of her pain, but the memory of the 100 silent guardians on her lawn was a testament to her worth. 6 months later, the halls of St. Michael's Hospital felt different. The frantic energy was still there. It was, after all, a hospital. But it was tempered by a new sense of gravity, of respect. Sarah Jenkins walked those halls not with the hurried shuffle of an overworked nurse, but with the steady, deliberate pace of a woman on a mission. She had a slight limp, a permanent souvenir from the nerve damage in her side, but she carried it not as a weakness, but as a credential. She was no longer Nurse Jenkins. She was Sarah Jenkins, the hospital's first ever patient and staff advocate, a position created for her and funded by the Henderson Foundation. Her job was to be the voice for the voiceless, for the scared patient confused by billing, and for the overwhelmed nurse afraid to report a safety concern. She was the institutional memory of what happens when systems fail, the people they are meant to serve. She passed the bay where it had all happened. It was just a space now, occupied by a new gurney and new machines. But for her, it would always be sacred ground. As she continued down the corridor, she saw a young nurse, barely out of school, hesitating outside the room of a notoriously difficult and verbally abusive patient. The nurse's shoulders were slumped, her face a mask of anxiety. She was psyching herself up for the confrontation, alone. Sarah changed her course. She walked up and stood beside the young woman, who looked up at her with something akin to awe. Sarah gave her a small, knowing smile, the kind of smile that says, "I've been there." She placed a reassuring hand on the young nurse's shoulder. "I've got your back," she said softly. "Let's go in together." The final image was not of a dramatic rescue or a grand gesture. It was of Sarah, the scarred but unbroken healer, standing shoulder to shoulder with a new generation, continuing her life's work. She was no longer just healing wounds. She was defending the healers. The watch had not ended. It had simply been passed on. And in the quiet corridors of St. Michael's, a new, more resilient kind of honor was taking root.